Well, I just sat down and finished watching the final episode of Fire Force, something which doesn't really quite even feel right coming out of my mouth yet. I imagine pretty much anyone who has followed this series since the anime began and experienced what at least felt like a 10-year gap between season 2 and finally what ended up being the third season, the final season of the show, probably feels about the same way. Like, it doesn't quite feel real after waiting that long for things to kind of just it feels like you blinked and it was over with after all this time. I did enjoy a lot of this final season, although I think I probably have a lot of the same complaints overall that a lot of other people did. Now, I am someone who decided at some point in that, what I think was actually like a 5 to 6 year gap, decided to go back and start picking up the manga from where season 2 left off. I didn't read it all the way through to the end. I think I read right through the end of the big Captain Burns fight, and then read a little bit longer. And I think what really made me stop,
it's just not worth it,
was just that as someone who had watched the anime since the beginning of the first season, I really felt like an integral part of my Fire Force experience was the voice acting, the sound effects, the music, the really stylistic flames of the Fire Force animation, and of course, as anyone who remembers how freaking good the first 2 seasons looked, just how well animated it was. But perhaps more than anything, I just had this strong sense, like reading through Shinra's rants about how he was the hero of this world and all that reading it did not hit the same as watching the anime, and I was so accustomed to, once again, the voice acting, the sound effects, the music, and the particular style of animation that it had. So when I found out that the third season was in fact confirmed, I decided to stop there. It might also be useful here to talk briefly about some of the more general stuff that I liked so much from the first 2 seasons, especially as the story and the world building are concerned, as it has been 6 years for many of us. I have always loved the government and Fire Force related conspiracies, the corporate corruption subplots, the seemingly screwed up relationships that surprisingly often led to more interesting than they first seemed character dynamics and chemistry between key sets of characters, primarily the pillars and their guardians, such as the lazy, overpowered bully of a Hajime Corporation salaryman, and the unpredictable, uncontrollable power of his requisite pillar. Fact being that only the overpowered bully really had the strength to control him, and the royally screwed up constitution that it took to bring him back down to earth when he went totally out of control. Dynamics like that were screwed up, especially amidst the controversy of Hajime Industries' literal human experiments, but all of this just weird, screwed up characters served to make the world of this series so much more interesting and so much more alive. And all of that in general, the corporate, government, military, corruption subplots and conspiracies, the hashtag fake news propaganda that was used against Section 8, the deeply religious lore and history of the world, the inner conflict that those coming to terms with the realities and histories of their religion faced, Captain Burns and the Sister Iris in particular. These sorts of things all served to plant seeds along the journey that made watching the mysteries of the Fire Force series unfold over the years, at least for me, far more interesting than many other long-running shonen that I've watched over the years and more recently. Top it all off with 2 seasons of solid, consistently great fight animation with fittingly some of the best fire effects in all of anime, sound effects so beefy they should be illegal, an excellent soundtrack, and straight up heavy metal opening sequences with real edge but also really melodic catchiness, great visual comedy, and also just some of the most hilarious bits in scenes like the one where, the whole crew accidentally gets high off of the natural laughing gas emitting from the hostile desert. That cut of them laughing their asses off, hanging off the back of the fire truck is glorious. One of the funniest things I've ever seen. And it also has what so many series are almost completely lacking in today: incredible sex appeal from a wonderful array of both male and female characters alike. I mean, this is really a series that just straight up celebrates the human form, and although obviously more of it is the females than the males, they really don't shy away from just showing off how great these hulking firemen look. And, obviously there was the hilarity of the calendars that they sold and all of that. But anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the things that made me love the series over the years, as I fear a lot of people have likely forgotten how amazing this series was for like 48 episodes straight. 48 episodes straight of one of my favorite shonen of all time, including what a lot of people probably consider less important, the unabashed sex appeal and the overall hilarity of the series compared to many of the other shonen that we've seen over the years. In particular, another one that sticks out to me being the sequence of fights between Tamaki and Assault, because a lot of people complain about her fan service, but I think a lot of people also forget that she's the whole reason that arguably the funniest episode of the series exists, alongside an endearing flashback that somehow worked perfectly with her otherwise utterly retarded Lucky Lecture ability. But anyway, we'll get back to that a bit later in the video. And of course, then the third season did finally arrive, for better and for worse. I think I felt a lot of the same criticisms that a lot of people online did in the first half of the third season. That was, obviously, it's, compared to the first two seasons, certainly not nearly as consistent, with a couple of, really good-looking standout fights and standout moments in fights, but a great lack of the consistency that we were so spoiled with in the first two seasons. And, of course, as many people have already talked about, also the sense that they were really rushing things through. When I found out that the third season was coming, I thought for sure that this was either going to be a third season, which would be followed by a fourth season, or they would pull an Attack on Titan, where they would, have the final season and the final season part 2, and then the final season part 3, the movie, that type of deal, when I was looking at just how many chapters were left. Okay, so I did go and check this out for clarification's sake.
I'm doing the math, man.
So there were 175 chapters covered in the first 48 episodes, or the first two seasons, which amounts to basically an average of 88 chapters covered per season for the first two seasons. So that's a switch from around 88 to 129 chapters covered in basically the same amount of episodes in the third season, which is an increase of about 46% more chapters covered per an episode. I know that it's always going to be a bit of a loose metric trying to gauge like the perfect amount of chapters covered per an episode, since there's a massive difference between covering dialogue and covering action sequences with basically no dialogue, blah blah blah. But 46% more chapters per an episode? If you don't think that this was rushed,
What the hell are you talking about?
as much as I enjoyed what we got, and I really did enjoy what we got, this definitely needed more room to breathe. And this was certainly a trend that continued into the second half of the final season. Obviously, I think anyone who watched it will agree with me that it looks significantly better, much more consistent, and the creative, really clever stylistic decisions in the second half of the final season in implementing this idea that the collective human unconscious was manifesting into the physical, visual, real world. The way that they drew the ocean waves as these traditional Japanese ukiyo style. I think those were watercolor paintings initially. The, super simplified but colorful stars, and of course the iconic moon from Soul Eater looking down at the earth below, all these sorts of things, as well as the live action sequences and all of the other really trippy sequences.
Oh God, it's so good.
I also thought that there was a really cool parallel at work between the idea of the image of humanity's collective unconscious manifesting physically in the real world, and the way that many of our core characters also became the manifestations of different sort of archetypical symbols. What Licht, I can't ever remember how to say his name, what Licht referred to literally as world builders who can guide people's imaginings. The hero, the knight and the dragon, life and fertility, the guiding light of humanity, etc. And obviously the Despair Sanctus, who like represents the reflection of all of humanity's unconscious, blah blah blah. In turn, there was the idea of this feedback loop between the performance and mind state, the hope versus despair of these symbolic individuals, and the state of the aforementioned humanity's collective unconscious. When humanity's light was extinguished and the hero's spirit broken, naturally the image of humanity's collective unconscious latched onto the prophetic apocalypse that they all feared, the second great cataclysm, and the world set ablaze. Am I saying that there's some great intellectual content to be found there? Not necessarily. I don't see a lot. I'm not sure that there's much beyond the simple idea that thoughts do in fact affect the real world and how people perceive themselves and others, if only in a second order kind of way.
So you might hear people say something like, that's so meta.
And just a lot of creative novelty in the basic idea itself. It is nice to think of this, however, as just another expanding piece of the lore of Fire Force, which I do think is a very expressive, living, breathing world, built up on an ancient lore, government conspiracies, corporate corruption, and all that good stuff. But anyway, I really enjoyed all of this stuff, but it was very obvious in that second half, once again,
that it was really being rushed in a lot of ways.
I don't think you really had to go look at the episode to chapter comparisons to get that feeling when you've seen the big conclusions to important final character fights, like the big Benimaru fight being started and over with, even as beautiful as it may have been. And to touch on that for just another minute, because I am a big fan of Benimaru and would have been absolutely livid if he didn't get some kind of conclusive fights. As far as the first fight goes, I loved the flashback with his mentor and the old leader of Asakusa highlighting Benimaru's fight with his mentor's doppelganger. Even if, maybe the flashback could have used a little more room to breathe. The animation in the fight itself was some of the best in the final season, highlighted beautifully by some of the most inventive imagery of the populace's subconscious image of the environment manifesting in the real world's world design, giving this fight one of the coolest stages in the entire series, with the ukiyo waves and the background, the moon and all that. It was just, once again, so short-lived that I feel it lacked the impact that it should have rightfully had for such a capstone moment in the story of the strongest fire soldier, Benimaru Shinmon. And of course, the memes do write themselves for his second, admittedly fittingly short-lived fight against his own doppelganger this time. The only man who is allowed to beat Benimaru is Benimaru, and Benimaru wins in a landslide. That was really funny. And although I would have personally still liked a little more pomp and circumstance building up to the bubble bursting subversion of your expectations for a big, long, bombastic fight that would shake the heavens and burn the earth to a crisp, you could argue that the joke is kind of accentuated in a sense by the swiftness and effortlessness with which he just punches a hole in the other Benimaru who's trying to charge up some kind of big dumb ultimate attack. What a retard. He just punched a hole through him.
I really don't give a damn!
Either way, I still really liked this one, and I did get a big laugh out of it, as I so often do watching Benimaru move through the world of Fire Force. But if you were to go look at the comparisons, there were episodes where, it was fairly normal, 3 to 5 chapters, but then there were episodes where they were shoving like 8 to 10 chapters into a single episode, and you felt it in these massive fights where it really felt like, in my opinion, a really proper full adaptation. We would have seen more of the back and forth between the big final Benimaru fights. In that case, perhaps part of the joke was that, as usual, he just demolished all of his enemies, even himself. But also, seeing, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but going against Halmea's shield and defender felt like it was over so much quicker than what really would have been more satisfying, seeing a bit of a back and forth, and the sensation that so many of the explanations really just kind of characters were really just talking through the plot as it kind of rushed through it at times. I continued to get that sensation throughout, but once again, the presentation and the consistency was certainly better in the second half. To continue on with the presentation though, once again, I really enjoyed the fourth wall breaking live action visuals, the really haunting and simultaneously kind of hilarious cuts to live action Sumire talking about the state and history of the Fire Force universe, as well as some of the mixed media info dump sequences, which really reminded me more of anything, not just of course to some of the similar conspiracy minded scenes of the first season early on, but also kind of reminded me of a classic Metal Gear Solid Hideo Kojima game, the way that he would intermix all of the interesting live action cuts of people walking through cities and the like to get the idea of connections in the world and all this.
There's no such thing in the world as absolute reality. Most of what they call real is actually fiction. What you think you see is only as real as your brain tells you it is.
You could tell that even though they were kind of rushing through things, they really wanted it to be a unique visual experience nonetheless, not just with the fourth wall breaking live action sequences, but the mixed media sequences, the collective unconscious of all of the characters of the world being manifest in the visuals of the world of the show. Of course, it all still felt fairly rushed, and you do have to wonder why they did it that way, why they didn't turn this into a 3-core season or a season 3 and then a final season. It's difficult to say whether this is David Productions, really trying to wrap this up as it's been such a long running series for them, and they're wanting to maybe focus more on something like Undead Unluck or whatever else they've got in the pipeline. I guess this could just as likely be a decision that came down from the production companies. Maybe some of the TV networks or the distributors weren't getting what they thought they would get out of this as a long-running action shonen, and so they decided that it was really only worth dedicating 1 or 2 more time slots to. And just to be fair, if we were going off the number of reviews on Crunchyroll, for example, even though it has a full 3 seasons, a complete series, it has less than half the number of reviews as newer, shorter series. Kaiju number 8, Gachiakuta, Freerun, Dandadan, MHA, not even to mention things like Solo Leveling, Jujutsu Kaisen, Demon Slayer, blah blah blah. And if we were to go over to my anime list, we could see that the second part of the 3rd season aired alongside Hell's Paradise Season 2, and Hell's Paradise Season 2 has twice as many members on my anime list. It's unfortunate because it is one of my favorite modern action shonen, but it does appear to be outshined by pretty much anything else that people would consider a prominent modern action shonen. Anyway, it's difficult to say why exactly, but as nice as the presentation of the second half of the final season was, all things considered, it all still felt fairly rushed through. And I think it made a lot of moments which could have been more impactful, a lot of fights which could have had a more interesting back and forth, classic traditional shonen fight dynamic, feel as if they were kind of just one-shot sequences, which we then swiftly, as quickly as possible, moved on from. As far as wrapping up the actual story, I do think that's something I'm gonna have to sit on a bit more. A lot of it was very hit or miss, admittedly. Perhaps part of that comes down to the fact that I'd already been spoiled on the fact that this was, going to be like a world-starting prequel to Soul Eater, which is obviously another great shonen action anime by the same original author of the original mangas of the two. But other than that, a lot of the metaphysical stuff, a lot of the philosophical conversations towards the end were a bit hit or miss for me. If anything, I think the most interesting thing was to think about them as just kind of a window into the mind of the original author and the way that he sees the world. There were some extremely hard-hitting moments throughout. With that said, definitely the twist where we found out, and in retrospect this seems kind of obvious, but the twist where we find out that Sister Iris is actually the doppelganger, she's actually the copy of Amaterasu. That part, I'll admit, blew my mind, and at the same time it was one of those things where obviously Amaterasu is older than her, and we've had this concept of doppelgangers for a while. That should have felt fairly obvious, but that one definitely hit me hard as an interesting plot twist. What really obviously hurt in the moment, to touch again on the impact of the visuals themselves, the cuts of Iris and Amaterasu like impaled on these giant pikes when Shinra finally arrived, that was definitely haunting and heartbreaking. In the end, obviously the final episode basically just brings everyone back to life in a roundabout way, minus the ones who decided to, embrace despair or whatever. You could argue that in retrospect makes that whole thing kind of meaningless, but in the moment it definitely did hit me hard. Seeing how many of the main characters of this series the author was really willing to beat and batter in really brutal ways, and have some of them just straight up basically give in to the dark side, give in to despair completely, was something that I didn't expect. And like watching that alongside Hell's Paradise at the moment, it was really a stark reminder of how much the tone of a lot of modern shonen anime has changed, and continues to change, of course, as things go on. But overall, once again, I think a lot of my feelings about the story itself really just come down to it being hit or miss. There were moments that I really enjoyed, and then there were moments that, a lot of moments which were mostly just fine. I think some of the highlights would definitely be Arthur versus Dragon. That was amazing. I loved that one. I'm not sure I currently have that much in particular detail to say about it, just that it looked beautiful. I loved the set pieces and the sheer sense of scale to it all. I loved the sequence of them jumping out of the clouds to attack each other. Obviously, the outer space sequence was awesome, and I loved the backgrounds there, which were totally distinct from the Earth's backgrounds created by the collective unconscious. I thought the fight overall had a wonderful balance of epicness with those brief highlights of Arthur's classic hilarity. It was just a really good time. Obviously, one of the best fights of the season. One of the things that I am still kind of confused about, though, in the case of Arthur, is what in the world was the device that he was given that allowed him to breathe outside of the Earth's atmosphere?
What's in the box?
Okay, so anyway, I looked back and it's something called the Star Ring.
Okay.
バルカンから星のかけらの余りをもらって作った星の指輪です。
Okay, so I know that his powers have kind of had a meta element for a while, being that he's a JRPG-esque knight, now an ascended knight king and all that. And at this point, maybe it's silly to even ask questions like this with symbols becoming reality in the world of Fire Force, but I would have really liked a little more explanation as to why the ring let him breathe in space of all things. What Yu's plan was for this, if he had one to begin with. Were they just leaving it up to chance, just, whatever he used it for? Anyway, it's probably literally just that Arthur's ability is so absurd at this point that he's capable of manifesting the reality he wishes for, not just for his own level of firepower, but also for the ring itself and his accessories, so to speak. Basically, he thought that it would allow him to breathe in space, so it did allow him to breathe in space. I think that's actually probably it, going by the history of his fights. More likely than it actually being a ring that allows you to breathe in space. But also, why is Arthur even still alive and intact before the world was reset, even though he got cut in half in the previous fight? Does this have something to do with his transformation into a literal RPG video game character with a literal HP bar? I did notice some of his teleportation and smoke effects transformed into straight up pixel art before the fight began, which was a really nice touch. But did Excalibur just somehow bring him back to life? Is this literally a video game mechanic? That one I'm actually flabbergasted by, to the point that I feel like I have to be missing something, but anyway. Okay, so upon further review of the Arthur v Dragon episode, I think that the quote-unquote explanation of this actually might lie in the little mixed media intro sequence to the episode, where Arthur states that he basically views space as something resembling the realm where the Night King rests. So I think we're basically going on a kind of Superman logic here, whereby basking in the light of the sun in the resting place that is the vast void of space, Arthur is capable of healing any and all wounds. Once again, because that's how he imagines and believes it to be, and therefore that is how it is. I think that's the real, full explanation of this. And on a side note, as long as I'm on the subject, after watching this all the way through and reviewing a lot of these episodes while editing this, am I the only one who's utterly convinced at this point that Arthur is probably legitimately the most powerful entity in the entire Fire Force universe? His very thoughts manifest into absolute reality so long as he believes in them enough. Interestingly enough, embodying the idea of the manifest collective unconscious power of the Fire Force universe in a single human, in Arthur Boyle. He was also the only person capable of hurting Dragon. He all but sliced the earth in two, and then did it again after a light nap in the sun. Twice.
I'll fucking do it again.
He has, by his willpower and imagination alone, transformed multiple, basically regular human-created objects into divine relics capable of fantastical, unimaginable powers. And he's the only one who got to keep his fucking powers after the world got reset, because he was too busy chilling in space to have his powers taken away, which I can only imagine he escaped by hitching a ride on the back of a comet, re-entering Earth's atmosphere with his body set completely ablaze, crash landing on Earth at 100,000 miles per hour, and then standing up with a smile on his face, because Arthur Boyle is the king of the fucking universe. Benimaru might be the most powerful fire soldier. Shinra might be Black Asian anime Jesus, but Arthur is literally God. He is a literal God who bends the very fabric and nature of the universe to his will on a fucking whim on any given fucking Tuesday, and they couldn't even take his fucking powers away. Arthur is a literal god. Anyway,
I started blasting.
I really got a kick out of freaking Assault coming back to fight his own doppelganger in defense of Tamaki's sexuality. I know a lot of people were complaining about this scene, and I'll admit there wasn't that much depth to the actual back and forth between Tamaki and the lady. It was a little bit shallow, not something that bothered me, just a little bit shallow and kind of, overstating a lot of very obvious things. It's Assault actually coming back into the fray to defend her in the way that he did was really, in my opinion, a great capping stone for the many punchlines that we got out of these two characters, as well as an awesome way to conclude Assault's character arc, with him finally coming to terms with his true feelings and understanding that the real way for him to overcome his weakness to Tamaki's feminine wiles was to simply embrace his love of that sensuality and sexuality instead of trying to defeat it or repress it. Yes, my boy's become a man. And although I might not have absolutely loved the depth of the conversation between Tamaki and the others on the willingness to embrace the erotic and all this stuff, what I did like was, once again, remembering that all of this was built up on the flashback that we got with Tamaki a few years ago, showing us that a lot of her personality traits and her self-esteem issues about her ability and the way that she's had to present herself because of it. All of this manifested from her experience when she was younger, trying to cutesy herself up and trying to look good for herself, only to be seen as some kind of slut by her peers, thanks to her not so lucky ability. I understand a lot of people don't like fan service and all this, but I think a lot of people really downplayed just how well they made that flashback work with things. Obviously, there was the one other idea kind of core to this sequence with Tamaki that I forgot to mention in the moment, or at least elaborate upon properly, which was the idea put forward that her manifest eroticism as one of the quote-unquote world builders was supposed to be the symbol of life and hope and fertility. Obviously, going by a lot of the conversation online, it seems like a lot of people didn't really latch on to the admittedly somewhat more shallow ideas within the argument itself between Tamaki and the old hag who was antagonizing her, which was pretty goofy. Like, even though there were all of these character manifestations and civilians in turn being swept up by the spirit of despair and the death of hope and everything to sort of explain this away in a sort of metaphysical sense, it was still very difficult to take seriously this woman complaining about the chick who's literally trying to save her life right in front of her in the middle of the battle just because she was, showing off her tits too much while doing so or whatever. But I did at the very least really like the idea itself coming forward that eroge, the erotic made manifest in her character, was this symbol of fertility and life and hope for the future.
シンラ君がヒーロー、小隊長が天使、オービ大隊長が皆を導く光という役回りがあるように、彼女は命の象徴なんだ。それは未来につなぐ希望だ。
At least it was something of a conclusion at long last when she herself decided to throw her shame to the wayside and just embrace her sexuality openly. And once again, this was riding on the back of what was, in my opinion, a really great flashback from previous Tamaki episodes. The old hag basically just intentionally slandering her because she was jealous and wanted to control her. She wanted her to be as reserved and submissive as she felt that she was supposed to be. I just felt like it was worth pointing out all of these things because it really feels like people give Tamaki the short end of the stick just because she's the fan service character in an age where shonen anime are basically scrubbed clean of fan service altogether, even when adapting manga that have tons of it. And sure, her Lucky Lecher ability and the fan service gag of her clothes basically just falling right off is incredibly ridiculous and occasionally very offensive to people who care about such things, but I just don't really have a problem with fan service to begin with. It's just a thing that anime has that I like as long as it's drawn good. The gag itself is straight up retarded on its own, but ever since I've seen that flashback scene, I've had a real respect for her struggle with her natural look and that ability and how it causes not only the online communities in the real world, but people in the show itself to perceive and treat her. Once again, paralleling this scene with the old hag, the girls that she grew up with ostracized her when she was totally innocent, more likely than anything simply because they were jealous. They lashed out at her, literally calling her a whore just for wanting to have a cute hairstyle regardless of her intentions. And it's pretty obvious if you read between the lines, they're basically insinuating that she only liked the twin tails because she liked it rough, and her being showy was unacceptable to them because they were afraid that she was going to cut in on their turf. I'm not saying all of it, the gag especially, is exactly perfect or even palatable for a lot of people, and she didn't exactly get the best first impression with her introduction to Shinra in Season 1. I do think that done a lot of damage to the way that people perceived her in the long run.
Accidental gropings are probably the most asinine trope in all of anime history, and every single accidental groping that has happened since Evangelion deconstructed the trope nearly 2 decades ago is the worst scene in whatever series it belongs to.
But I just find it really frustrating that people look at her character and pretend that there's nothing at all to it, just because they have a distaste for the fan service gag itself. And often, frankly, people are just embarrassed of the show that they're actively choosing to watch and obviously enjoying. As you so often see these people say online, you can't watch this show around other people. But anyway, enough about all of that. I just wanted to defend my girl for a minute since she always gets the short end of the stick and very few people are willing to stick up for her and acknowledge the actually really good parts of her character arc, which did finally conclude in something that clearly paralleled her original flashbacks and showed us how she had grown in her self-esteem and her willingness to embrace who she is. The fight itself, once again, I just got a lot of laughs out of it. And same thing with Arthur. Obviously, Arthur has always been one of the funniest characters in the show, and I think they really done a great job in this one. And then, of course, there's Shinra. Shinra, who, basically became some sort of demigod to reset the world. What I did actually really like, as weird as this was as a choice in the story, one of the things that I really enjoyed, didn't expect to as much as I did, was finding out that Shinra, the sort of self-proclaimed hero of this world, was, quite frankly, like literally Fire Force Jesus, born of a virgin as the savior of this world and the one who came around to reset the world state of the world and bring a new peace upon it. That was a very interesting twist. Once again, similarly to finding out that the sister Iris was in fact the doppelganger of Amaterasu and not the other way around, this strange twist to find out that Shinra was quite literally like in-universe Jesus was really satisfying for some reason.
Oh shit, you mind if I praise the Lord? Go ahead.
I'm pretty sure I completely forgot to mention Captain Burns, which I think I could be forgiven for given his absence for most of the second half and his returning in a completely unexpected form, but that's actually like way relevant to another important character. So as far as this beautifully retarded twist, so as it turns out, at least as I understood this scene, Captain Burns was literally so pure and Christ-like in his faith and devotion to Japanese Catholicism that his soul, planted deep in the rock that is our Lord and Savior, could not be controlled by the body of his demonic doppelganger. That is such a retarded twist, and yet simultaneously it's totally awesome, and it also actually is super lore relevant because it completely explains why Shinra's mother is able to maintain her doppelganger form with her original identity and personality intact. Because she's literally Japanese Mary, the virgin mother of Japanese Jesus. Of course, her soul would just be that pure. And of course, we could get into all kinds of psychological analysis stuff here if we wanted to talk about that whole conquering your shadow thing with the forms that these characters ultimately take, but let's not turn another anime video into a Carl Jung lecture. I just wanted to appreciate the meme level comeback of Captain Burns just being so devout, such a holy servant of the Lord, that he could not be contained by the body of his doppelganger. Absolutely brilliant. And it even explains like some of the metaphysical lore stuff about the broader series. They flashed by it pretty quickly, so I could forgive people for not really putting two and two together on that part, but that was really cool. Anyway, as for the question of why some characters' doppelgangers look human and some look like infernals or demons, I've seen some people say that this is also explained by the whole human collective unconscious thing. Obviously, Amaterasu is viewed with reverence by the collective, so her doppelganger naturally looks human. Benimaru is viewed with reverence as the most powerful fire soldier, so his doppelganger also naturally looks human. But Captain Burns would clearly be viewed with reverence as he is literally the most holy fire soldier and one of the highest ranking servants of the Holy Soul Empire and the Church of Japanese Catholicism. And yet his doppelganger is arguably the most demonic looking one of them all. Now, I'm not saying that this unexplained inconsistency is some massive issue that I take with the series. Honestly, I think the author probably just decided that that it would be best to go with whatever looked best, most aesthetically pleasing, and most thematically appropriate for the scenes where each one was introduced, but I do think it's worth admitting that this element isn't exactly carried out perfectly. And with that said, if someone else has a better explanation for all of this, please do let me know. But it's important to also keep in mind, just a random thing that I noticed watching the episode again, he then shows up in the epilogue and is totally fucking normal again, just looking like a human. What? Why? What changed? Did whatever changed him end up changing Mary Kusakabe eventually? Who fucking knows? Once again, similarly to finding out that the sister Iris was in fact the doppelganger of Amaterasu and not the other way around, this strange twist to find out that Shinra was quite literally like in-universe Jesus was really satisfying for some reason. And ultimately, of course, it once again culminated in this idea that he would devalue the value of life in this world and thus make death a meaningless, almost like marketable, funny, child-friendly concept, thus like changing the rules of the universe such that a character could literally have their head chopped off and then just plop it back on. It's so strange. Once again, so many of these things, I don't know how much philosophical depth there necessarily is to any of this stuff, but very interesting as just a window into the author's mind. There were definitely other lines throughout this episode, voiced through Shinra that very much gave me that impression that we were really just getting an idea of the mind's eye of the author in sort of like a similar vein to I know a lot of people will say this is stretching it, but into Anno's mind the way that we did in Evangelion and the end of Evangelion. Something else which I did not expect this to remind me so much of.
There is little difference between how you interpret yourself and how the others interpret you.
So what I think is me is me. What I recognize as self is myself. I'm no more and no less than the sum of my self-awareness, but I don't understand myself.
But the very idea of like everyone being swallowed by the flame and like how Maya trying to basically get rid of everyone to escape the inevitable despair of life and all this stuff, having just a handful of demigod-like characters reset the state of the world in this way, really reminded me of Evangelion in a crazy way.
大災害はこの世と人類のイメージ、集合的無意識を一体化させること。
Now, of course, what I mean by this is, in the same way that in the end of Evangelion, all of the characters basically return to the primordial soup of the universe, that orange goop, LCL, giving up all sense of individuality from person to person and melding together to escape the suffering that individuality and the necessity of communication, as well as the reality of living in a horrifying hellscape dystopia with giant alien monsters trying to take over the world all the time. Can't forget about that part, but mostly to escape the psychological horror that individuality, communication, and interpersonal relationships inevitably entail, with Shinji then eventually deciding that it would still be worth it to accept all those downsides, self-actualize, and become an individual among individuals again, that would be better than to escape suffering altogether, just to become part of one singular superhuman consciousness. In the same way, here in the end of Fire Force, everyone returns to the Great Flame, but through a once again trippy and fairly philosophical, metaphysical sequence, Shinra, the hero of this world, the very specifically symbolically manifest hero with a capital H of this world, decided that it would still be worth putting humanity back the way that it was, even if it would inevitably lead to the cycle of violence and revenge, and once again, despair, specifically being the main universal antagonistic force or concept that they kept coming back to over and over again here. This, at least to me, felt like a pretty intentional parallel. And of course, you could go into things like the idea that there are multiple recurring cataclysms in some sort of cycle, just like there are multiple recurring impacts in some sort of cycle in Evangelion. Blah, blah, blah. There are all sorts of different directions you could take this. I do think that there are a lot of parallels, although I'm not 100% positive that it was any kind of full-on reference. Who knows? Am I saying it was necessarily as coherent or as well written as the end of Evangelion's similar sequence? No, not exactly, but I did think that it was an interesting enough take on that same idea and a pretty cool parallel to a classic ending that I really love and cherish, but in the vision of a totally different author through totally different characters, not leaning on the very same, character archetypes as Ava. But anyway, I think that there's plenty of interesting subtext that is carried along with it into this series by creating this parallel, and I just wanted to explain that further because I didn't think I did in the initial recording. But anyway.
And so then it's the end of consciousness and free will for individuals, as we know, and a true 2.0 in a very bad way, hive mind consciousness with an AI jacked into everyone, knowing our hopes and dreams, delivering it to us, not in some PKD wirehead system where we plug in and give up on consciousness because of unlimited pleasure, but because we're already wired in and absorbed before we knew it by giving over our consciousness to the system of our daily decisions that was able to manipulate and control into a larger system.
And once again, like a lot of these stylistic choices here, the influences I felt, and maybe some of these are stretches, but these are all Japanese media, so maybe it's intentional. There was like the vibes and presentation, stylistic choices of things like Neon Genesis Evangelion, as well as, in my opinion, like some of the strange Kojima direction choices of something like the classic Metal Gear Solid games. I really enjoyed the way that they brought that to life in the anime, and even if they did, really sort of rush through a lot of what I felt like could have been more satisfying moments, and even though the final season definitely did not live up to the quality of life standards across the board that the first two seasons had consistently throughout, I still enjoyed the final season of this show quite a bit. A few of the stronger episodes in particular. Obviously, one other thing that was interesting and just gave a bit of catharsis was getting to see which characters hooked up with who in the after-story epilogue sequence, including all but outright confirmation that Shinra did in fact have kids with both Iris and Inka, which unfortunately isn't necessarily quite as based as it sounds at first. I did go back and read the dialogue between Inka and Shinra, and Inka basically insinuates that Licht could, basically just artificially inseminate her. She doesn't outright say that, but she does insinuate it, joking that she would never actually want to be with a boring guy like Shinra. She just wants his kid because she's sure that it's going to be so damn strong. Obviously, one other thing that was interesting and just gave a bit of catharsis was getting to see which characters hooked up with who in the after-story epilogue sequence, what their roles were going to be moving forward, at least an idea of what their future subsistence would be between the ending of Fire Force and the beginning of Soul Eater. Just enough that I can kind of dream up my own ideal version of what kinds of adventures they might have gotten up to over the years, and what sorts of after-journey daily lives they might have settled down into eventually. That was simple, but pretty satisfying. With that said, maybe this is the point, but it is a bit difficult not to think of it as being especially cheesy, given the fact that they really went out of their way to bring back almost literally everyone, hero and villain alike, who had died over the course of the entire series in this world reset with, new metaphysical rules, including Hajiki and the White Clad, who literally cut his head in half and then immediately fell in love with him after they were brought back. That was pretty funny though. But they even brought back Mr. Domestic Violence himself, Rekka of all people. Once again, I do think that the flippancy with which things are handled here is kind of the point, and it's not like he goes as far as like trying to resolve the tension with Rekka and Tamaki or anything like that, which would be a bit too far for me even. But once again, I do think the flippancy with which things are handled is kind of the point. Shinra's vision was one of a world where people treated even concepts like death, which we look at with such reverence, here seen with absolute flippancy. So I do think that that's kind of the point, but still it's pretty hard to take seriously when you bring back the dude who kicked Tamaki in her poor, lovable, crying face. I know that in some sense I'm supposed to let bygones be bygones, but that's a character I'm not sure I can forgive, no matter how many times they try to tell me that, you know, he had good intentions and he was so good in the past and all this. But anyway, nonetheless, like on the case of Rekka, seeing his starry eyes and all that, there was also the other pro to this, where we got little hints, not just of which characters hooked up in the end, but also even where specifically the core characters in Soul Eater came from. Both those that were born to parents originating in the world of Fire Force and those which were created by the New World's symbolic entity, or deity, arguably, Death, from which this is a kid was created. This also included nice little touches like a quick glimpse of Blair from Soul Eater just strutting around the city, which I have to wonder, is Blair the New World's manifestation of Tamaki's curse in the same way that Arthur's sword was reborn as the living Excalibur from Soul Eater? I have no idea. Okay, so I did look into this a little bit and thought that I would clarify it since I myself was kind of confused, not just by the time skips, but by how fast things were going by. Technically, the cameo with Blair is anime only. That's not in the manga, and something that they didn't really point out in the anime epilogue is the bit with Shinra and everyone, like that time skip is 25 years later, but the actual time skip forward to Soul Eater, where we see the Soul Eater characters as kids, that's actually like 1,000 years later. So between them inserting a cameo that kind of breaks the continuity and not pointing out that the Soul Eater scenes were 1,000 years later, and then mixing those scenes in with the epilogue that was 25 years later, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was confused, so thought that I would point that out. Doesn't help how much things were rushed here. But anyway, it was all pretty cool though. The biggest downside being that it definitely felt like it just flashed by in the blink of an eye. Once again, an unfortunate symptom of the pacing of this final season. I found myself having to rewind a bunch to like even catch like which characters were those sitting with who there, you know, that kind of thing. There was just so much stuffed into there in such a short period of time. Once again though, pretty good job of tying so many of the archetypes of certain characters in with their character and role parallels from each other series, and giving us an idea of where the main characters of Soul Eater came from, who their ancestors were, which of our favorite characters fell into the throes of love now that the conflict was over, all that good, typical shonen time skip stuff. And I guess more than anything right now what I'm feeling is a desire to go pull Soul Eater off of the Blu-ray shelf over there and go back through and finish that one up. I never actually finished it because I eventually, of course, found out that it was an anime-only ending, but been wanting to finish that and, of course, go back and read the manga. I've read a little bit of the Soul Eater manga before, and a lot of the, I don't know how much of this was fan translation, but a lot of the translations and the vibes of that manga were surprisingly brutal. And yeah, I'd like to go back through that, experience that once again. If people watching this haven't watched Soul Eater yet, I would implore you to do so. It's a fun action shonen with many of the same stylistic vibes of this one. It's got really awesome groovy music. Love the OPs and EDs. It's beautifully animated all throughout, especially for how old it is. I really like the characters. It's absolutely hilarious. It's got all the same wacky, over-the-top stylistic choices of this one. It's obviously got the same brand of writing, and although it's a bit more subtle with it throughout, it's got a lot of sex appeal as well. So I mean, I think if you liked Fire Force, you will obviously like Soul Eater, the anime. I would like to, once again, at some point go back and read through that. Also, now that I have experienced the voice acting and the music and the sound effects and all of the crazy mixed media stuff that came along and the highlights of the animation for the final season, I do think it would be fun to go back through and see what was different about the manga, what really did get cut along the way. Was it just a case of things being truncated? Did they hit all of the basic points before they got through it, or were there things that just got cut altogether? That's something that I'm very curious about at this time. But regardless, I just really wanted to sit down and get some of my basic thoughts out on what is the capstone to one of my favorite modern action shonen anime. Certainly the first 2 seasons, still absolutely love them. And even though I do think there are things that those had going for them that never really amounted to as much as I had hoped they would, the conspiracies and the sort of religious symbolism stuff, they obviously did a lot with that. I do think there were lots of hints early on about corporate corruption, which I thought might end up going somewhere more interesting with the Hajime Industries sort of stuff. But ultimately, I really enjoyed this series. I really enjoyed the character dynamics. Right up until the end, it felt like everyone basically got a nice send-off with most of the characters that I would imagine are fan favorites, except for Maki. If there's any one major disappointment that I have with the ending sequence of this series, it's just that we didn't get enough out of certain characters. My favorite, everyone's favorite, Muscle Mommy Maki being the most obvious example.
How dare you call me a hideous man-eating gorilla cyclops!
You know, I have to wonder though. It's something that I have to wonder seeing the discussion between these characters. If Maki had received as much fan service as Tamaki, do you think anyone would be complaining? Anyway, she's a fan favorite. She's one of my favorites. That freaking witch costume of hers is unbelievably freaking sexy and super iconic, even though it only showed up for like a few seconds in the entirety of the series. She's got ties to the military through her family. Her powers are awesome and interestingly unique in the way that they react and interact with other people's powers. Her companions, Sputter and Flare, were always funny and kawaii, and in my opinion never overdone, and unfortunately not a whole lot was done with her during the final arc, in particular outside of mostly support roles in favor of giving the limelight to the young trio of Shinra, Arthur, and Tamaki. And I guess aside from the particularly offensive and embarrassing first impression of Tamaki's Lucky Lecher, maybe that's the actual deep-rooted psychological reason why so many people continue to have a problem with Tamaki and her spotlight scenes, because it does end up coming arguably at the expense of more time and fights that we could have spent with our girl Maki. Love them both, but that is the reality. Anyway, it remained really funny up until the end. Even as dark as things might have gotten, it never lost a sense of its humor, its stylistic presentations, blah blah blah. I enjoyed it. Not the way I would have liked for it to have went. Would have liked for them to have taken their time, given us, maybe a third core, a little bit more consistency with the presentation. But once again, the highlights were worth being there for, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm spinning in circles. I'm gonna call it there. Hope that you have enjoyed Fire Force as much as I have over all these years. And hit me up if there's anything you want to talk about it in the comments section. This is definitely one that I think I'm going to be thinking about for a little bit, deciding what I really think of the wacky, highfalutin, philosophical, metaphysical stuff that they went into in the ending of this story. But peace, as always.
Sister, Inori.
はい。炎は魂の息吹。黒煙は魂の解放。灰は灰として、その魂よ。
永遠の炎に着せ。
ラートム。